It's FAQ NYC Off Cycle, where the New Yorkers podcast from the newsroom by and for New Yorkers, the city, steps back to take different and deeper looks into some of the things that are always happening here in the only place in the world. I'm Katie Honan. Today, you're going to learn about a man named John Hedderson, who was born and raised in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. As a kid recovering from the chicken pox, his mom gave him a paint-by-numbers kit, and that set off a life defined by art. Looking at it, studying it, and, of course, creating it. His paintings are massive and bright and filled with the people, places, and pets that made up John's world. But art was not his day job. He worked security for Breezy Point, delivered heating oil around the city, at lumber yards in Manhattan, later opened up his own shop in the meatpacking district, worked as a handyman and as an unlicensed contractor, even owned his own gallery in Chelsea just to make ends meet. He got married, had one daughter, he kept working, and he kept painting. In the summer of 2016, John had a big break. One of his paintings was exhibited in MoMA PS1's Rockaway show in Fort Tilden. John was volunteering at the Rockaway Artists Alliance at the time when other members encouraged the curators of the show to include his art. Months later, he died at home, leaving behind his daughter MaryAnn and, of course, his art. MaryAnn joins us today to talk about her dad, his art, and her efforts to get his paintings exhibited around the city. But first, let's hear briefly from John in an interview I did with him in 2016.
I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to be a motorcycle cop. I wanted to be, everything that every kid wanted to be. Excelled in art class in high school. I fell in love with it and found it interesting, really, really interesting. So that's really what motivated me. And I've really been painting ever since high school. You get an education in art, how it works, how it's developed, who's important, why they're important, and you apply things, you steal. I like to use the word steal. You steal what you can from the great painters, and you try and combine and put those elements into your own work, and it really enriches your painting. So it's something that grows as you grow, and it's a reflection of your life and what it means to be a painter and an artist.
Thank you so much, MaryAnn, for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And just off the top for our listeners, Mary and I are friends. So, there's that familiarity. That is obviously why. But I've always been so fascinated by your dad. And I find his story, right, of so many other creative people, especially here in New York City. You're an artist, you're a writer, you're an actor, you're a sculptor, and it's not your day job, but you just do it because you love it. And, I know now that his artwork, 4 of his paintings are at Espresso 77 in Jackson Heights, Queens, will be exhibited for a few more weeks. I know this is sort of the first of what you hope will be more art shows of your dad's work as you're kind of going through it all. So I first briefly wanted to just have you talk about your dad, describe who he was as a father and as an artist. I know he said that those are sort of the 2 most important jobs of his life. So just kind of paint a picture, pun intended, for our listeners about what that was like and how he maybe even, I know he really inspired you as an artist yourself.
Oh God, who was my dad? What a heavy question, right? Because he was such a New York character. That's the best way to describe him. I mean, he was born in Brooklyn. He spent summers in Roxbury Beach, Queens, which was really, you'll see, and which is why I titled the show Roxbury Beach and the Prince of 14th Street. He was greatly influenced by the beach, loved the beach, but was allergic to, he was allergic to the sun. So he would get these really bad sunburns. So he would go out either super early in the morning or late at night. And most of his businesses, he owned a lumberyard for many, many years in the meatpacking district, lived in Manhattan for many years. He was a New York character. He had long hair, big bushy beard.
Yeah.
And he just was probably one of the nicest, selfless people you could really ever meet. He was always looking to help somebody, was really a community mainstay in the meatpacking district for probably 25 plus years. between the store, between working at Prince Lumber, which now moved, I think it's now up on like 10th Avenue in the 50s.
Yeah, I think so.
He worked there for a while. He worked as a handyman at Marked Restaurant, where I actually ended up working too when I graduated high school. And he worked for, as a handyman in that area for a really, really long time. But yeah, I mean, he was a great dad. There's no other, he was just a great dad. He was always my number one fan. I did theater for a long, long time. And I had a one-woman show and did stand-up comedy for a little bit. And he was pretty much at every show. He was at every single show, videotaping it. He built sets for my show and backdrops. I did the show called Almost Maine. And he created this like 8-foot by 8-foot canvas of the Northern Lights, which was outrageous. And it unfortunately got destroyed that was one of the paintings that got lost by Hurricane Sandy. I mean, he did it all. He drove me to school every day. From my sophomore year, I got mugged on the train going into Manhattan. And then that was it. He was like, "You're not taking the train anymore. I'm driving you in every single day." And he did until, I mean, he even drove me into college, now that I think about it.
So let's talk about that. That's what I always, and that's and again, I think for our listeners, we talk about this a lot. New York City is such a it's New York City. That's it, right? Mm-hmm. But there's so many different distinct places, and it's such a dichotomy for me to think of. Growing up on the peninsula, right? You did not see many people on the peninsula like your dad with a ponytail and his paint splatter jeans. And one thing you said was funny. One job he didn't have was he got offered, I guess, a job to be an FDNY dispatcher, which is like the dream union job. And you said he refused. He didn't get it because he wouldn't cut his hair.
He refused, because he didn't want to cut his hair, and it was he didn't like all the rules. It was too many rules for him.
So that's what I find so interesting, and it is in his art, which we'll include it in the podcast to look at it. This true, when you're from one part of the city, especially a place as weird and insular as the Rockaway Peninsula, and I mean Roxbury is his own beast, right? You're not to insult it, but it's like there's literally, it's gated and it's crazy. So to have that mix of living in Manhattan as a young person, being an artist, encouraging you, his only daughter, to not go to the all-girls high school I went to. Instead, go to school in the city, which I will say, knowing you a little bit, knowing about you in high school, you were totally intimidating, like the cool girl going to school in the city, So I see, instead of smoking cigarettes on the boardwalk, you smoked them in Manhattan, but
on the stoop.
On the stoop. Can you describe, how you think those both worlds were painted by your dad? And maybe even, did he have trouble with it? Was it, I know you said he kind of.
Yeah. Well, my dad always, and I kind of found our childhoods very similar in that way, that we always never felt like we fit in and could really find our place and be ourselves in Roxbury. I mean, obviously, I found my crew.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crews down there because, Roxbury, it's so many generations of, Irish families, Irish and Italian later on. And it's very clannish down there, to be quite frank. Like, it's very much, you find your clan, your crew. It's still overall a community. And they take care of each other. But, you have a very specific crew that you grew up with. And my father never really fit in that space. He was a security guard for a little while for the co-op. And he had some crazy stories from that. But he was the black sheep. I mean, he was a hippie. My family, my grandfather was a World War II vet in the Navy. He worked on the fireboats. My dad's oldest brother, he was also a Navy vet. He went to Annapolis. He was in Vietnam. My Aunt Janet, she was in the Union. She worked for before it was Verizon, it was Bell, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was, and even before that, I forgot.
So she was a CWA member.
Yeah, she
Strong
was
union
a
household.
yes,
Yeah.
strong union household. And my dad was, he discovered art in high school at Zavarian. No, I should say he discovered art, like you said, when he got the chicken pox.
Yeah, but he really got good at
But
it in
he
high school.
really got good at it, yeah, in high school. Brother Clem at Zavarian. Shout out to Brother Clem. Who really transformed him into, he became obsessed with art. He became obsessed with art. He became obsessed with painting. There was a painting hanging, I don't know if it's still there anymore. There was a painting of his hanging at Zavarian for years. I mean,
wow.
probably like 20 years. And that's not what you do in Roxbury. You don't, in Breezy. You don't, not to say that the artists don't exist down there, because they do. There is a strong artist presence now, thankfully, because of the RAA and the Rockaway Artists Alliance. But it's just not what you do down there. You become a fireman, you become a cop, an EMT, you work for the city, you work for sanitation, and there's a lot of rules to follow, right?
Yeah. So again, obviously this is a podcast, so people can't, we're talking about art, we're not looking at it, but how would you describe your dad's paintings in particular? I know he sketched, he did his live model, that was sort of the tools of being an artist, but his thing were huge paintings. So if you wanted to describe what it was like, and I know, as we can talk about later, as we've gone through his paintings, you see this evolution of him as an artist. You can almost tell what decade it was made in.
Sure, yeah.
But so how would you describe it to someone who's never seen it before?
He was a rule breaker. He mastered the rules, and then he constantly broke them I think it was in many ways, out of spite, to just be a rule breaker. But they were, wild. He was always influenced by nature and the beach and animals and birds in particular. Very colorful, though they, a lot of his earlier work, especially in college, he hated using color.
Wow.
So much so, he would fight with one of his professors, and it was a color class. He would fight with one of his professors and write in what the color should be, as opposed to actually using the color as spite. So that's the type of artist that he was. He always was, he was an art history major. He had a degree in art history from Hunter College as well, and a fine arts degree from Syracuse. And he was obsessed with the greats. He loved Frida Kahlo, George O'Keeffe. He loved Bonnard, Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, and he loved to. He said it himself. He would steal from the greats and then, flip it on his head. He would put patterns together that don't necessarily, you think that they wouldn't look good together, but they do. He was always inserting his own sense of humor into his work. There was nothing, he tried to never really take himself too seriously. I'm looking at a painting right now of, my two stepkids and my niece and my nephew, and they're on the beach and they're all making these really silly faces and staring back. One kid has Taylor has her tongue sticking out and her hands up by her ears, making that little moose hand motion when you have the antlers. He never tried to take himself. He took himself as an artist seriously, but not too seriously. He hated the art scene. He hated when an artist, when their ego was too much, too big. He was always humbling himself in many ways when it came to his art. It was meant for him, but it was really meant for other people to enjoy, and he wanted to make it accessible. That makes sense.
No, it does. And you did not mention he loved people, pets, nature,
Yes, people, pets, yes.
and naked ladies.
And naked ladies. Yeah, imagine my childhood bringing friends home. Bringing friends home to my house, and my walls are covered in, nudes. He was influenced by Egon Schiele, who was a figure painter, and really played with space. And if you look at his work, he exaggerates what the human body, particularly the female body, exaggerates the form. And my dad really did that in his work because his paintings were so massive. I mean, I had one of my father's college friends' daughter-in-laws. Her and her husband got a painting on a permanent loan. That's what my father, when he would give paintings to family and friends, he would say, "You're getting this painting on permanent loan. But if a museum wants it, taking it back." That was his big thing. But she sent me a painting that I hadn't seen, God, since I've been in probably middle school, maybe high school, and it's of my cousin Krista when she was maybe about 7 or 8 years old, and he was playing with perspective. And, traditionally perspective, it's where your eyeline falls. And the painting almost looks, I'm actually working on a post. I'll be posting it probably later next week. It looks like an acid trip. A lot of his, like that, it's sometimes you look at his stuff and you're just like, it can be overwhelming. And, one of the critiques that he always used to get, and he used to say, screw you. Can I say that?
Yeah, you can say that. You can say
screw you. He would just put so much on the canvas that you would stand in front of it. You can stand in front of it for 10, 15 minutes reading it. His paintings were really a long read where you could stand in front of it for 10, 15 minutes, walk away, and then come back and see something that you hadn't seen before or noticed before. Mm-hmm. Another thing that he liked to do was hide his signature within the painting so that then it became a game, right? Then it becomes a game. It makes it accessible to kids.
Yeah.
He loved kids. He loved we come from a big Irish family. So, there's no birth control. And there's a million kids running around. And my dad, he liked to create these whimsical, wild stories that could be accessible to a 2-year-old or to a 90-year-old. And that's really what I feel like his art was, what he tried to do anyway.
And you'd brought it up briefly earlier, but what was it like? I know he owned a gallery in Chelsea on 27th Street, but scenes, it's so, when I think of success and trying to be successful, what defines success? Is it just fame and fortune? But how you felt his interpretation of the New York City art scene was, and I know you had said that he said, "Oh, I'm going to be, I'm only going to get famous when I die," which is prophetic. Yeah. But, growing up around that, what would he often tell you about it? And then I guess then we can go into, when his painting was shown at this big show locally.
Oh, gosh. Well, he rejected a lot of the art scene, but he still managed to somehow be on the forefront. Like you said, he owned a gallery in Chelsea before Chelsea became like a mecca for galleries for many years. He was well known in the neighborhood. His art was well known, but what do you do with 8 foot by 8 foot paintings or 6 foot? You know what I mean? They belong in museums, and it's kind of hard to really show work like that. Not to say that it's not possible, obviously. But growing up around that, I didn't know anything else.
Yeah.
I didn't know, I would go to my dad's lumberyard on a Saturday because he always kept it open on a Saturday. And I mean, quite frankly, I don't remember anybody working there. I really don't. Like, it was it was a hangout. It really was a hangout for other artists, for musicians, for actors.
Yeah.
I think at like my dad at one point was like hanging out with, oh God, what's his name? He was in The Sopranos. Michael Imperioli, is that his
Oh,
name?
yeah.
White
He's an
Lotus.
artist too, in addition to being an actor.
That was like, he used to hang out in Chelsea all the time. That's where and he would hang out with my dad and my dad's friend Terry, who was also a photographer. And they had this, they actually used to do handyman and general contracting work together. But for me, it was just like, this is just my life. I would just go to the lumber yard, and it was probably one of the most dangerous places to ever to have a kid ever be. And I was just running around and just playing, and it was so much fun because all of these different characters. I mean, it's the meatpacking district in the 80s and the early 90s. It was like one of the most dangerous places.
Yeah. You're just running around.
And I'm just running around. I mean, I would collect. My dad and my mom too, my mother's an artist. My parents always influenced me to create, to make art, and to not worry about what other people have to say about it. It's for you. It makes you feel good. So, I would be like 7 years old collecting scraps of wood in the lumber yard and making these, with wood glue, making these sculptures. And I would sit out front of the store and sell them for like $20 a sculpture. And
people would pay you $20.
So this is like my claim to fame. Okay. Used to drive my dad crazy. There was an art dealer. His name was Alan Crespo. He was very big in like the 80s and 90s. And was friends with my dad. And he would tell my dad, John, I can't sell your art. It's too fucking big. Sorry. It's too big. I'm sorry. It's too big. And my dad, whatever, they still were friendly. And Alan would come in the store and, have my dad try and make frames for him and things like that. And he saw me out front selling a sculpture and bought one of my sculptures. And, I'm like, $20. This is awesome. I can't believe I sold this. And my dad could not believe it. Alan, sorry.
Your dogs is fine.
That Alan bought one of my sculptures. Like, he's like, for years, I've been trying to get this guy to buy and sell some of my artwork. And you're sitting out here with your wooden sculptures, and he bought it. So that was like my claim to fame with that. And he used to drive my dad nuts. But it was it was just a creative hub for people. It was just a hangout. My dad just had this way of making artists and people feel comfortable.
Yeah. So yeah, if we could just now, talk about how he got to exhibit his art. And, Rockaway after Sandy was such a weird place because it became cool and hip, and you had this influx of artists and artists from the scene and money and, MoMA's involvement. And that's how they developed a partnership with the Rockaway Artists Alliance, which your dad was a volunteer for. So you want to talk a little bit about his opportunity to be included amongst all these other artists. And then I know I was at that event too, the weirdest dinner ever where Salman Rushdie was there. I'm looking around, I'm like, the editor of the Rockaway Times newspaper is here, and so is Salman Rushdie. Like, what is going on?
So for many years, when, we lived in Brooklyn for a little bit, and then we bought a house in Roxbury, and, his life really became more about me. He became devoted to me, and he, as any devoted father is, I mean, it was soccer practices. I was really involved in theater. So his life became, when we moved to Roxbury, it really became, he was doing a lot for me.
Yeah.
And his art, he was still painting every day, but his community, when he left, got smaller, and it became hard for him to maintain that social life amongst his crew of artists and people that he really loved. And I was always pushing him. I knew about the Rockaway Artists Alliance, and I really started pushing him probably when I was in college. Like, Dad, Rockaway Artists Alliance, it's literally right across the street in Fort Tilden. Put yourself out there. And I pushed for so many, many, many years. And as charismatic as my dad was, he was still, he was kind of shy in many ways, breaking into something new like that. And then after Hurricane Sandy, now I'm trying to think if my dad joined either before or after. It was either right before or right after he finally joined the Rockaway Artists Alliance. His studio got completely flooded. He managed to save, I would say, probably about 80 to 90% of his artwork. But he lost all of his supplies, his computers. My dad, when he would paint, he, a lot of it was just freehand and from his mind, but he was also a photographer and would take photographs of things, of family members, portraits, friends, and use them for a lot of his artwork. So he lost his computer, and really lost his space to paint. And he knew that his studio in his basement, that was his safe haven. But if living in Breezy and Roxbury, you're always getting water in your basement. It's not really a great place to store paintings or paint or create. So he found the Rockaway Artists Alliance, through me pushing him to be a part of a community, to work with other artists. And he put himself out there, and God, he became like, they loved him. And what's not to love, right?
Yeah.
He was such a selfless part of the community. He was always volunteering. I mean, he was doing handyman work there, fixing stuff, climbing up on the roof, I think, one time and seeing if there was a leak up there, just like he was just always involved. And he was always, he learned he really honed his skills on hanging art shows when he owned his gallery in Chelsea, and was always hanging shows for them, making frames. He had a drawing class, a drawing group that he would go to every Monday night in Brooklyn, and he would bring members, drive members from RAA with him to the art, that class. But, after a couple of years working with them, and they got this grant to work with the national parks and MoMA PS1, they were like, you got to check out this artist, John Hedderson. They really, really pushed to get my dad's work viewed and to get it in the show, because they knew how special his work was, but also how special he was as just a person. He was just such a great guy. People, if you meet him, I mean, you instantly fall in love with him. I mean, he was so charismatic. He just knew how to make people feel comfortable. And he was always cracking jokes, and so they really were the ones, they pushed him to get him into that show, and that's what happened. He got in, and his and you'll, in the interview, his the creation of bees
Yeah.
painting was one of his last. That was like his last, I want to say, I think that was his last show. Was that show in I think that was 2016?
Yeah, it was the 100th anniversary of the National Park
Thank
System.
you.
No, of course, and it was a big show. And when I interviewed him in 2016, obviously, I knew him and I knew you, but it also was a very compelling aspect of it because it was someone locally. And obviously in Rockaway, there's always this fear of like the outsiders coming in.
Sure.
And I think even with MoMA PS1's involvement, whether it was the dome that they built in Rockaway on 95th Street or with RAA, I would always hear rumbling, oh, they're coming in, blah, blah, blah. But it was nice to have someone who was a legitimate member, who was so involved, so active. And then he also got shown alongside, there was a concert, Patti Smith concert, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and some stuff. Just their involvement.
I mean, he ended up hanging Patti Smith's show, which was like, my father, he looked up to, in many ways, Patti Smith and her artwork and her singing and just that scene, right? She was in the Hotel Chelsea. She lived there, for Christ's sake. So for him to be able to do something like that and work with her, my dad, who's so disarming, he was like, I made her laugh. Like that was such a big deal to him. The big deal was making her laugh. It wasn't him hanging, her artwork or helping her set up. I can't, now I'm the name of the show that she did specifically, but she had that beautiful white bed.
Yeah.
The middle of that building.
As we are filming this, the building in which Patti Smith and other artists' art was shown is currently on fire in Fort Tilden, which made, as I was prepping for this interview, I was like, is this really happening? But yes, unfortunately, when hopefully the fire will be out by the time this comes out, or else it'll be really bad.
Let's see if that building's still there. But to help her set that up was really special to him. So, it's so very much like my father to gain notoriety right before he God love him, passes away. I mean, that's just John Hedderson, and you said before, my dad always said he's not going to become famous until he dies. And that was my job, was to get him famous. So here I am.
Not to laugh about death, but I guess it would be appropriate. I guess we can talk about that. So this was, the summer of 2016, this, bizarre opening again. We're sitting at this weirdo dinner. You were there. I kept
on
the beach in Fort Tilden, and I'm like looking at this crazy cast of characters, and then I look over and I go, is that Salman Rushdie? Like off to the side? This is not the Rockaway that I grew up in.
Right.
That you grew up in. So I was like, what? I think I remember going to Kevin Boyle, who was the publisher and editor of the Rockaway Times at the time, and I was like, what the hell is going on? But that was just the surreal nature of it. But we can talk about, and I know your dad passed away that September, and you could share, he was found in front of
So my dad suffered, he had a long history of health issues. He had ulcerative colitis, was on prednisone for many years, and it brought on diabetes. And then he had a series of strokes in the probably last 10 years of his life. He had a stroke, his second stroke, he actually lost his peripheral vision and had hand tremors from it. It's incredible, but he had to basically reteach himself how to paint. Mm-hmm. And it's not noticeable to anybody other than probably me, and if you really study his work. But yeah, he was in his studio sitting in front of a blank canvas. I mean, it sounds like the ending of such a great movie, right? Like he really did. I mean, it was very hard for me, obviously, because my dad was very, he was young. He was only 62 years old when he passed away. Right? 62? Yeah. So him passing away that young was hard on everybody else, obviously, except him. That's exactly how he would have wanted it. He still had all of his wits about him. Obviously, I mean, he was still running around and working really, really hard. I mean, after he had his second stroke, I was like, Dad, I think it's okay. Like, I mean, I was in my 20s at that point. And living. I mean, I had a full-time job. I was living in Brooklyn. I was, engaged to be married. And I told him, you don't have to work as hard anymore. And he just did. He was just always working. He ate, he slept, he worked, he painted. That was his life. That's all he did. But it was that's just who he was, to pass away in front of a blank canvas in his art studio. Like, I can't think of any other way that he would have wanted to go.
So let's talk now, on the second part of it, right? Your mission as a daughter, right? No pressure. You just have to get your dad's art to be famous now, while taking care of your daughter. But I know I've helped you going through his art. I have one of his paintings on permanent loan. Hopefully permanent. In my living room that you had never seen before. It's of a blessed mother holding a baby. It's called Madonna and Child, but she kind of looks like Madonna the singer, and the baby Jesus kind of looks like him, and it's fun, and it always has people like, what is this in your living room? Which is what I love about it. But if you want to talk a little bit about the process that you're going through now of cataloging his art, it's on Instagram, which we'll tease, obviously, we'll promote, but then also trying to get his art up. And if you want to talk a little bit about what it was like, hanging his art, in Espresso 77 in Jackson Heights in this gallery, and seeing people's reactions to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a daunting task. He's got close to like 40 years worth of sketchbooks and drawings and these huge paintings that are rolled up and, in my basement. And it's such a, I am 4'11", and I physically, for me to pull these canvases out is nearly impossible. But my husband will just pull out like 10 at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I'll unroll them, and sometimes I've seen them and sometimes I haven't. Or I don't remember them because I was a kid, I was little, or, I think you and I found a painting together that I'd never seen before. It was a couple on a park bench.
Yeah.
With that mime, I think it was a mime.
What's this mime doing here?
A mime behind them. It was in Central Park. A mime is behind them with a knife, I believe.
It's so
getting ready
weird.
to rob them. Just like weird, like where God, he was just always his brain just operated on such a different level than everybody else. But it's very emotional to, because it's like, when somebody dies, you're if you've ever had a loved one pass away, and, particularly a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or whatever, you go through their things, you keep what's important, you toss what isn't, you donate. This is like an ongoing process for me. And I really have to be in the right mindset to go there, because it's very emotional. Every piece of artwork is, my dad's energy is still there, right? Energy never dies. And it's a very emotional process for me to sit there, to study the painting, to, then to photograph it, and to sit down and physically write about my father's work and any memories it brings up for me. Sometimes they're painful. Sometimes, sometimes they're wonderful. Sometimes it's things I hadn't even thought about in years. When I got that, when I was looking at that photo from my father's friend, of that painting that she had on permanent loan. I hadn't seen that painting in high school, and it immediately took me back to like, oh, I remember this painting. It was on show at a Sill gallery, and it was his solo show. And I remember being a kid, and before there was the internet, and you sent out postcards to people, and I can remember sitting there and putting stamps on postcards of this particular painting. And at the opening, I'm 13 years old, working the bar, giving out wine to people. My 8th grade teachers showed up because I invited them. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, how cool is this that my teachers from Mark Twain, from middle school, Mark Twain.
Everyone who goes to Mark Twain, you got to mention you went to Mark Twain.
I know you hate that. That's why I said that. My teachers from middle school showed up. And so it's a wonderful thing, but it's a lot emotionally. And I try to do it as much as I can emotionally handle it. That's the best way to put it. As much as that I can emotionally handle it. Because I also, I have a toddler running around, and I and I freelance production work. So it's a lot, but it always, once when I finish a post for the Instagram page and I put it out there for people to read and for people to see, it really makes me happy, because I know the joy that my father's work has brought to people over the years, and the joy that it's brought to me. And I just, God, as corny as it sounds, like, I want to spread the joy, I want to, like, the world is a really wild place right now, and art is important, and his art is important. So it's important for me to get it out there and be as personal as I can be. And then also try to look at it, shout out to New York City Museum School, where the first time I ever learned when you look at a painting, what subjectively and objectively, and writing down just like what you see and what you think the story or the theme or what the artist was going through at that time, that's an important aspect of painting as well, is the story around creating this piece.
Yeah. Well, Mary, I think that's a great way to end it. I want to promote john.e.joe.art on Instagram. You're posting his art, posting the stories behind them and your recollections of it. 4 of his paintings, correct, are on display right now.
And for sale.
And for sale. I mean, not permanent and forever.
I know. I know so many people are buying art right now, but
yeah, everyone's got it's at Espresso 77, 35-57 77th Street in Jackson Heights. And I appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate you. You've been such an angel through this process. You really have pushed me to get his stuff out there. And you really are the one that connected me with Espresso 77 and the wonderful crew over there. God, it's what an amazing cafe. What an amazing
great.
They really are. They're so wonderful there. Go there and see the art, please, and buy an iced coffee there, because it's bomb.
FAQ.
This has been FAQ NYC Off Cycle. We're part of The City, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom dedicated to hard-hitting reporting that serves the people of New York. Our work is freely available to everyone at thecity.nyc and is supported by listeners like you. Go to thecity.nyc/give if you'd like to pitch in. We are an affiliate of NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research, and a proud member of the Brickhouse Cooperative of Independent Journalists, Critics, and Artists. Find it all at popula.com. Our host this episode was me, Katie Honan. Adam Camara is our engineer. Thank you, listener, for joining us and making it this far. Be kind, be cool, and we'll be back soon with more.